Good day and welcome virtually to the Canada School of Public Service. My name is Isabelle Racine and I am the Executive Director for the National Managers Community, the NMC. On behalf of the school and all of us at the NMC, I would like to welcome all participants to this event. Please log off your VPN to help you experience the event at its fullest. If you're experiencing technical issues, it is recommended that you relaunch the webcast link provided. Please note that you can send your questions throughout the session by pressing the raise hand icon in the upper right corner of this screen. Someone will be monitoring the inbox throughout the event. I'm pleased to introduce today's event entitled Building Diversity and Inclusion for Managers in the Public Service. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that I am in Gatineau, Quebec this afternoon, my apologies, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Waki, Mohawk, and Omam, Wiwim, Iniwag, Algonquin. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land on which you sit. I would like to take this opportunity to formally welcome our newly appointed NMC Deputy Minister Champion, Arun Tangaraj. Arun is Associate Deputy Minister at Transport Canada and will be joining us today as one of our panelists. I also need to express my sincere thanks to Christine Donahue, who for the past 3 years has been a truly great champion, not only for the NMC community and managers across the country, but also for our NMC team. Thank you, Christine, and welcome, Arun. I'm very pleased to add that joining Arun today for this important discussion on diversity and inclusions are Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister, Diversity and Inclusion and Youth at Canadian Heritage, and Nathalie Laviada-Jaudoin, Director General, Respectful and Inclusive Workplace and Champion for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the Canada School of Public Service. Welcome to our event, Gina, Arun, and Natalie, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Fostering diversity and inclusion and managing discrimination in the workplace have been highlighted by managers from across the country as topics we need to address as a community. The NMC recently participated in a roundtable led by the President of the Treasury Board, the Honourable Jean-Yves Duclos, along with Greg Fergus, Parliamentary Secretary. This was a critical discussion meant to help further the work to foster diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in the public service. It is clear that we need to find constructive ways for us all to learn more and work together as managers to support the Government of Canada's effort on diversity and inclusion, and also make our own teams better, stronger, healthier, and more welcoming to all. We hope this event is a start in the right direction. Today is an open forum for learning, and I would like to emphasize that it is a safe space for dialogue and conversation. Throughout today's event, I invite you to please further the discussion by sharing your thoughts and key insights on your preferred social media platforms using the hashtag LDM for Learning Days for Managers 2021, hashtag diversity and hashtag inclusion, and don't forget to tag the NMC. And I will now hand it over to Arun Tangaraj for some opening remarks. Arun?
Thanks, Isabel. And unlike this morning, I was able to get myself off of mute on time. So that's a success for me. Well, thanks very much for those kind words and the warm welcome. And I'm very pleased to be with all of you here today and take on the role of the DM champion for the NMC. The work that you do is of great value, not only for managers, but also to the entire public service. I've come to learn that virtual events like this are just one of the many ways that NMC uses to engage managers across the country. On top of acting as the voice for managers, the NMC also helps managers connect with peers and senior leaders, as well as discover useful tools, resources, learning opportunities to assist them in achieving their goals and to better support and manage their teams. So this is my first official event as the DM champion, and I could not pick a better and more worthwhile topic to launch my time as champion. This is an issue that's important to me. Building a diverse and equitable and inclusive public service is an obligation for us as public servants, but it's an opportunity that we all share. And we must work together to achieve this objective. Over the last few months, we've there's been a lot of deep reflection on the unjust treatment of Black people and other racialized groups and Indigenous people in Canada. As the clerk mentioned in his recent call to action, we must take action in ways we know will be meaningful in addressing barriers and disadvantages. As you know, we're in the early stages of an important and long-term effort across the public service to build a respectful, welcoming, inclusive organization where all of those with talent, enthusiasm, and a desire to serve Canadians have an opportunity to succeed. As a group, we need to invest in developing inclusive skills and establishing a sense of belonging and trust for all public servants, as well as those joining us now and in the future, regardless of ethnicity, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, or gender expression. So thank you. I know this will be a great afternoon and a great discussion. And so thank you for joining that with us. And I'm looking forward to an engaging session. So without further ado, back to you, Isabelle.
Thank you, Edwin. I would like to introduce to you our key presenter for today. As mentioned previously, Nathalie Laviadèche-Jodoin is the DG Respectful and Inclusive Workplace at the Canada School of Public Service, and she will be leading the presentation on tools and guidance to managers to address systemic racism and racial discrimination. Before I pass it over to Natalie, I would like to make sure everyone is comfortable accessing and using the digital survey platform that we will be using today for a few anonymous interactive pools. We are going to try a quick practice run. I ask you to please use your phone to scan the QR code or enter the access code you should be able to see on your screen. They were both also included in the participant email you receive. You can connect via www.wooclap.com and enter the access code NMC 2021 on top of your screen. Please make sure to press submit once you finish voting so that your answer can be recorded. And remember that your answers to the questions are anonymous. As a practice, I would like to ask you to answer the following quick questions. In which province or territory do you work? I'll let a few minutes for voting. So we've got right now a lot of participants from the National Capital Region, but I'm noticing, we're starting to see all the various regions of the country appearing on the screen. Interesting. I'm glad that we have representatives from ocean to ocean, as we like to say. Okay, I'll go to the second question. So the second question, are you a manager, an aspiring manager, or part of another community or group? Okay, so the majority of those who have joined us are managers, but we have representatives, also aspiring managers and other representatives. Thank you, perfect, seems to be working. Okay, so without further ado, I will now pass it over to you, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have been invited to present to you this resource, which I should say is a great collaborative effort between the NMC, the Canada School of Public Service, as well as DiversiPro, who's a consultancy specializing in diversity and inclusion strategies and management. So with that, slide 3, please. So this presentation is really meant to start the conversation and help managers begin to understand and identify the impacts of systemic racism and racial discrimination in the workplace. In this presentation and during the following panel discussion, we'll be covering some of the tools and suggestions for managers, but that can also be applicable to all public servants. We do want to recognize the fact that managers themselves, and perhaps some of you joining us today, may have been the victims of racism, and that we all really bring unique experiences and values to this discussion. While this presentation here won't specifically address mental health impacts, we do need to acknowledge that there's a very real possibility that there are employees on your teams that have suffered trauma as a result of consistent oppression, racism, and discrimination, and that this will have taken a toll on their mental health. It's also important that we acknowledge the mental health of allies themselves, whether they be managers, colleagues, or employees, can be impacted as well. There are several mental health resources out there that all public servants should be aware of and encouraged to use, including the Employee Assistance Program, Mental Health Commission of Canada, and you can look at Canada's Mental Health and Wellness website to find out more. Next. So recent tragic events have led to a clear call to action across the world. Examples include the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the US, and those of DeAndre Campbell, Joyce Echaquan, and Andrew Loku here in Canada. This worldwide outcry that began following George Floyd's violent and senseless death in May 2020 was followed by demonstrations across the globe. In major cities across Canada and the world, the message was really clear: Black Lives Matter, and the systemic racism and discrimination that persists in our institutions and among those with privilege and power has to end. The recent violent acts against Indigenous, Black, and other racialized groups in the US and Canada has really brought these issues to the forefront and has required all organizations with a conscience to act now and bring about long overdue change. Next. So even though we're hearing and speaking about it now, perhaps more than ever, we do need to realize that systemic racism in Canada isn't new. Systemic racism has for over 100 years created workplace barriers for Black, Indigenous, and other racialized employees. And these barriers have led to adverse effects or consequences, including an impact on the mental health of such employees, but also has caused and can cause an overall decline in workplace wellness and the inability, frankly, to serve Canadians to the best of our ability. It should be clearly understood that team members, whether they be senior management or newly appointed public servants, may arrive at the workplace, either a physical space or a virtual one, with a wide variety of experiences, of values and needs. And as these topics are sensitive in nature and impact all employees to varying degrees, we do need to re-emphasize the importance that everyone needs to know where to turn for help. Next. So when we think of systemic racism, we need to acknowledge that regardless of our intentions and desire to be open, welcoming, and fair to all people, the complex environments and systems we work in were largely built upon beliefs and values that may not be our own. Racism is inherent in our workplaces and how we work, and even though we may not consider ourselves to be racist or discriminatory. By definition, systemic racism, which is also known as institutional racism, are those cultural and values-based patterns of behavior, policy, or practice that either intentionally or unintentionally perpetuate disadvantages for racialized persons or groups, including Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color. I'd like to take a quote here from Daniel Kwan-Watson, who's the Deputy Minister Champion for Visible Minorities. And to quote him, he says, "Many tend to think of racism as the obvious outbursts of the spectacular, the burning of a cross or the shouting of a racially based insult. Racism, though, is like an iceberg to a ship traveling at night. You may or may not see it as you travel, but if you do, the visible part is only the smallest percentage of the danger you face." Next. Of course, systemic racism and its impacts are not and have not been limited to our workplaces or to ourselves in the public service. Systemic racism in Canada is not new, and it dates back to 1536, if not earlier, with the first coming of the Europeans. Were you aware that 25% of discrimination complaints received by the Canadian Human Rights Commission in 2016 relate to race, color, national or ethnic origin, and or religion? And were you also aware that 43% of hate crimes in 2017 were motivated by hatred of a race or ethnicity? I think it's important to emphasize that every employee has the right to our workplace free of racism and discrimination. The Employment Equity Act is a federal legislation. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is part of the Constitution, and therefore it's actually illegal to discriminate based on race, as well as the other 12 prohibited grounds. Next. So here you'll see excerpts from Dr. Theresa Tam, who's Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, her report on the state of public health in Canada in 2019 as it relates to discrimination. As you can see from this slide, discrimination is still rampant in our communities, with 1 in 4 Canadians experiencing at least one form of discrimination in their lifetime, and the most common type of discrimination reported by Canadians being racial discrimination. So before we continue, we're going to pause for a moment and ask you all a question that was actually in the Public Service Employee Survey. And that is, have you ever witnessed or became aware of racism in your workplace or at any time or place in your career? Please go ahead and use the WOOP application to submit your answer, and a reminder that these answers are entirely anonymous. Oh, so I'm seeing some very close numbers here between those who have and have not witnessed racism or became aware of it in their workplace. Just going to wait a few more seconds. We have a lot of people participating today. Okay. So I'd say we're probably in around the mid-40 range of those who, yes, have witnessed or became aware of racism in the workplace in the past 12 months. That's a very, very high number, I would say. All right, well, thank you for this. And Michaela, when you're ready, back to the presentation. So on this slide, you'll see the listed grounds of discrimination, and some of these flow, of course, from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A person's experience of discrimination is often linked to the compounding effects of multiple grounds. So based on their unique combination of identities, people may be exposed to particular forms of discrimination and may experience significant emotional pain and social harm stemming from such acts of discrimination. So I will note that these results don't account for intersectionalities, meaning some of the respondents from the bottom row may have also been victims of discrimination based on the numbers in the top row. And for those of you who may be less familiar with the term, but intersectionality is a framework which takes into account people's overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand the complexity of the prejudices that they face. Next. So time for another quick woo clap. So if you could take a few moments to reflect on the question of how you've reacted to the current social injustice movement and everything that has taken place over the past several months with regards to Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. Please go ahead. A lot of different emotions, from hope to anxiety to feeling inspired, motivated, sense of guilt, some fear, some relief, some disillusionment. Hope and anxiety coming through loudly. Inspiration as well, motivation up there too. Great. Yeah, so hope and anxiety as some of the clear emotions coming through. This is great. Thank you so much. Michaela, when you're ready, we can go back to the presentation. Thank you for this, everyone. Really appreciate your participation. So I think it's important to know, regardless of how you answered this question, that A, you're not alone, and that your actions and reactions are pretty normal and typical. I think it's important to acknowledge that as individuals, as managers, as organizations, and as a society, we're going through a significant transition. And I would be remiss here if I didn't also acknowledge the pandemic as being part of the mix. I think it's really important for all of us to take a moment to really understand the impact that these types of changes have on how we view the world. Next. So given all of this, what does this mean in terms of taking action as public servants and taking action more specifically as managers? So as public servants, some of the most important actions we can take include seeing anti-racism as a shared responsibility. It's not up to one group or one set of people to change behaviors alone. We need to ensure that co-creation, collaboration, and engagement with those living the realities is part of how we do business. So the philosophy of nothing without us, meaning if it's about me, it should be informed by me. Building a workforce that represents the diverse communities we serve, and using disaggregated data that we have available to us to drive our decision-making. As managers and leaders more specifically, whether or not you yourself have been or still are a victim of racism, first, well, it's being aware of our biases. Well, why? Our brain takes shortcuts based on our own personal experiences. Our brain has a tendency to categorize people based on characteristics such as age, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, and ability, disability. So checking one's biases, while not the solution to the entire problem, is an important place to start as part of one's responsibility, I would say, as a manager and as a leader, to be more self-aware. As managers, it's incumbent upon us to create safe spaces for our employees. Doing this by equalizing the space, checking our assumptions, and respecting the right of everyone to be human, to be imperfect, and to engage in that dialogue with our employees. On the question of dialogue, it's encouraging and leading that dialogue, that communication. Isabelle mentioned it earlier, these are not easy conversations, but as managers, we can be curious, but also not push anyone to share if they're not ready. And we have to be prepared to listen and be prepared to listen to the stories of those with lived experience. Listening, but also taking action and doing what we will say we will do. That's very important. Being an ally, and this is not a passive exercise. As managers in your organizations, we need to recognize when we need to take appropriate action. And finally, educating ourselves. It's not up to our employees to educate us. And so whether you're reviewing research articles, blogs, books, referring to learning offered within your own department, learning that the school and the NMC through sessions like this are offering, the resources exist. So committing to educating yourself and heighten your knowledge of these issues. So as a manager, you have delegated authority and management discretion. So here's an opportunity to use these to act proactively against racism in terms of your hiring and sponsorship practices, and in terms of leading your team by making space for voices, by amplifying and recognizing talent. Next. There is recognition that successful organizations bring together and understand the value that a diversity of perspectives, of backgrounds, of beliefs and experiences, of styles and cultures, that it spurs innovation, it increases productivity, and ultimately creates healthier and more respectful workplaces. So it's not, this diversity and inclusion question is not only a social justice imperative, that's very important, but I would say it also has time and time again been demonstrated as a business and productivity imperative as well. And our business in the public service is to serve Canadians. And in order to do so in the best way possible, we need to reflect the diversity of Canada within our own ranks. And so as managers who lead teams who are responsible for hiring and recruitment and talent management, I would ask ourselves, and I would ask you, does your team reflect the diversity of Canada? Does your team look like Canada? Next. So on this slide, we talk about cultural adaptability. And for leaders, it means being able to adapt our communication and management style to meet the needs of a culturally diverse workplace and team. So a culturally adapted leader understands that others may have different styles, approaches, and attitudes depending on their cultural background. So understanding these differences empowers leaders to bring about the best in their team. It allows us to enable all team members to contribute their unique perspectives and skills to the overall goals of the unit or of the organization. Culturally adapted leaders also commit themselves to constantly expanding their own horizons by exploring new ideas and approaches, and they work on understanding themselves so they're better equipped to understand others. Next. Diversity does not exist without inclusion, and it's therefore important to take a moment to examine what inclusive habits for managers look like. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through these one by one. However, what's important to realize is that when employees feel included, they feel a sense of belonging that drives increased positive performance results and creates collaborative teams who are innovative and high-performing and engaged. Employees who feel included are more likely to be positively engaged within the organization. Next. So being culturally adaptive and inclusive as managers and leaders is extremely important as we all work towards fighting racism. It's also important for managers and all leaders to know that one of the most important roles they can play is that of an ally. And so here, we're suggesting 5 actions that demonstrate allyship. The first is calling it out. So calling out discrimination when you see it. So this is about letting others know that their behavior is unacceptable. The tricky part being to make sure it is indeed discrimination and to call it out in an appropriate way. Another way to demonstrate allyship is leading by example, demonstrating actions that are intended to bring about equity and inclusion and holding ourselves accountable to advancing the needs of marginalized groups. The third is listening. Every employee faces a unique and evolving situation and may be affected by events related to systemic racism and racial discrimination in profound ways. So taking the time for careful, active listening and creating the space for employees to express themselves is very important. As an ally, communication, regular and transparent communication is critical to navigating this space, and a zero tolerance attitude for racism and discrimination is really where it begins. Moving from mentoring to sponsorship. Mentoring employees is no longer enough to foster equity and promotion among Black, Indigenous, and racialized groups. The next step is sponsorship, and sponsorship being defined as the proactive and instrumental help to advance someone's career. Next. So this is about taking action. It's everyone's responsibility, particularly for those of us in positions of management and leadership. So on this slide, we've outlined a few ways in which you can take action, but here are others. For example, interrupt offensive jokes or stories and say you don't want to hear them. Speak up when you witness discrimination, recognizing again that some situations are best addressed publicly while others privately. Educate yourself about human rights, about social justice. Be aware of how your actions might intentionally or unintentionally affect others. Think critically about the language that you use. Be sensitive to others' feelings. And question the validity of generalized statements. Next. So if you haven't yet, take a moment to read, reread, and absorb the Clerk of the Privy Council's call to action on anti-racism, equity, and inclusion, where managers in particular are being called upon to appoint racialized employees, to sponsor high potential racialized employees and prepare them for leadership roles, to support the participation of racialized employees in programs and in career development opportunities, and to recruit highly qualified candidates from racialized communities from regions all across Canada. We mentioned it earlier, talking about systemic racism and racial discrimination is not easy. However, it is crucial if we're going to not just move the dial, but make systemic change. So the message is crystal clear, as evidenced here by this quote, which for me is essentially the expectation that the clerk has of all of us in management and leadership positions. And essentially, at the end of the day, if we were to simplify it, is inaction is just not an option. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to engaging with you as part of the discussion. Merci.
Thank you, Natalie, for all the great tips. I took so much away from your presentation. We will subsequently share the presentation with those joining us today via the various NMC platforms, namely on GC Connects. We will also share the open letter from Deputy Minister Danielle Kwan-Watson in response to the National Post opinion piece by Rex Murphy on racism that was published in June. As mentioned by Natalie, the letter by DM Kwan-Watson is based on his lived experience, and we encourage you to read the letter and reflect on it and its content, and to engage with your teams on the important discussion. At this time, we'll open the panel discussion with a 5-minute introduction by each panelist, where they will be able to introduce themselves and talk about their story. So I'd like to start with Gina.
Thank you, Isabel. Good afternoon or good morning to those of you out west. Kwe, bonjour, anin, tansi. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I also want to acknowledge and thank Arun for taking on the role as champion for the national managers community, and for all of you who are involved in organizing this event. I am always grateful to my people, the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional territory I currently am. And from the Algonquin people, want to recognize all the ancestral lands on which you're able to do the work as public servants, wherever you may be joining this virtual event. And I also hope you're keeping healthy and well and safe and taking care of yourself and others. I really feel privileged to be part of this important conversation and to have the opportunity to hear from you directly on issues that are affecting you as managers across the country. At the heart of employee well-being to the federal public service are our conversations, what we say, our actions, and our personal commitment, and our dedication to our employees at all levels to creating a truly diverse and inclusive workplace, free of bias, racism, discrimination, and harassment. Respect is really at the core of our public service values and our ethics code. It's also very much near and dear to a core value of Indigenous peoples, and our elders talk about respect quite a bit. Treating all people with respect, dignity, and fairness is really fundamental to our relationships with the Canadian public, but it's really necessary for a safe and healthy work environment. So this year, coming almost to a year soon, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our lives in many ways, but we really need to tackle all forms of racism and discrimination to really achieve equality, equity for all Canadians. Even for myself, as a deputy minister, as an Algonquin woman, I've had to deal with my own share of racism. And so it is very, very much we're not immune from systemic racism in the public service. I've had experiences of not being seen or heard, being devalued, I would say treated inappropriately at times. And for instance, calling out racism, when I would often call out racism, get attacked afterwards, so there's quite a risk in calling out racism if you are going to be attacked. I've been re-traumatized by different events that have occurred within Canada, just recently with Joyce Echequan, where I found it very, very difficult to work for that day and the next day, and found myself feeling very, very ill at ease to be able to function appropriately. Having to always, for instance, some certain workplaces, looking at portraits around a room of colonialistic figures and being traumatized by that type of experience as well. So I would say that, throughout most of my career, I've seen racism in many different ways. As a Daniel Kwan Watson, Indigenous racism is very much alive and well and is in the public service. I have to confess, though, that I really consider myself very fortunate to have the opportunity to do the work I've done as a federal public servant. It was really my good fortune to discover early on what it was to become a primary passion in my life, which has been public service, that commitment to serving the public good and the collective interest. And I really want to acknowledge that despite all of those experiences, much of my experiences have been very positive within the public service. And things are changing, which is good. So for instance, I just want to draw your attention to, as others have, the clerk's call to action, as well as the Deputy Minister commitments on diversity and inclusion, which are really providing us with a clear blueprint to drive systemic change. As stated by the clerk, being a leader means taking an active role in ending all forms of discrimination, oppression, consciously and constantly challenging our own biases, creating an environment to which our employees feel empowered and safe to speak up. As Canadians, we value diversity, we're proud of it, but we sometimes forget to work at it, to fight for it. And if we do this, diversity will really be our superpower in Canada, and the future is really something we can dream of that we can have now. As a public servant and a manager, I've had the privilege to work with some amazing people at all levels, and again, want to reflect on that leadership experience. I look forward to answering your questions from this lens, from who I am as an Anishinaabe, Algonquin woman, and a deputy minister working in the public service. I want to thank you for your time, and I will turn it back to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Gina. I'd like to turn it over to Arun now.
For two, I got my mic working, I think, right? Yes, good. It didn't go this well in the morning. Thanks, Gina. And I'm going to coincidentally say a lot of repeat a lot of the same messages that you had. And so maybe just a little bit about me. I'm of South Asian descent. My parents moved to Toronto in the late 1960s. They're both nurses, and I grew up in Toronto, cheering for the best hockey team in the world. I will mention that a few times today, maybe. And apologies to those who aren't Leaf fans, but and it's interesting. I would really encourage you to read Daniel Watson's response to Mr. Murphy if you hadn't already. And it's interesting, as I read it last summer, a lot of what he wrote resonated. And I think if I really go back and think about a lot of my experiences growing up in Toronto and eventually moving to Ottawa, and as a student, as working in the public sector and working through school, a lot of the things that he said really resonated, and his experiences were not different than many of my own. I think the difference is, though, I never really thought about counting them. And I think he put a number to it. But to be very honest with you, I really didn't want to think about it at all. I tried to, you kind of put your head down and you hope, it's there, but you hope it isn't. But the reality is that is part of my life journey. It's part of who I am. Those experiences are ingrained in me as deeply as the color of my skin. Those are things that you can't explain. And as Gina said, some of it is, and Daniel wrote that you walk around the streets and you experience it. But as Gina said, a lot of it is what you experience in the public sector. Danielle talked about, even when he was traveling on a diplomatic passport. And so, yeah, it is part of my journey as a person and as a public servant. And some of it, as was said by Gina, some of it was very overt, and some of it was, subtle, and what we call microaggressions, right? I would, I would meet people, you know, when I talk on the phone and then I meet somebody in person, everybody goes, wow, you're a lot shorter than I would have expected you. And I can deal with that. And that's kind of true because I am short and you can't tell that from Zoom. But a lot of people, what I used to get a lot was, wow, you don't sound like an Indian. And, you know, and I think people expected me to sound like Apu from The Simpsons. And, you know, there was a great book and documentary read about that and about the stereotyping. I've had colleagues at work, you know, when we're out for lunch and say, well, can you explain to me how cricket works? And what are the rules of cricket? And I would say, I've never played cricket. I've never watched cricket. I grew up playing hockey and baseball and golf. But there was an expectation that I was going to be somewhat different. And it was a feeling of, am I measuring up to what somebody else would perceive as a Canadian, even though I was born here? And for the most part, all the way through my life, as I said, I ignored it when it happened. And I worked, you know, for a number of years to say, look, it doesn't bother you, you know, and I thought that not acknowledging it or not saying anything about it would make my life and career easier. But it didn't mean that I didn't deny its existence or notice when, you know, colleagues or others were subjected to that behavior. I just really didn't want to deal with it. And so why am I telling you this now? And again, if Daniel was here, I would say, you know, what his letter was very instrumental. But, you know, this is the first time in my career, and I've been in public service for about 25 years, I think. But it's the first time when I've been asked to introduce myself and talk a little bit about myself, where I haven't felt compelled to focus on, you know, my career path and the organizations that I've worked in, or, you know, what it was like, you know, going from economic regulation to being in finance. And I can talk to you about accounting if you really want. But this is the first time where I haven't felt the need, when I was asked to describe myself or talk about myself, that I had to do that. And yeah, those are things, and I think those are important things, and those are formative to who I am, right? But who I am I think it's a very interesting moment now that we are talking about this, and we are talking about this as in the clerk's call to action about why this is important to the public service. I mentioned 2 seconds ago, I'm an accountant, which means I have really odd hobbies and I'm a little bit of a dork. And so yesterday when I went home from work, I watched the Senate confirmation hearings of Merrick Garland as the Attorney General of the United States. And he was asked a question by Cory Booker, and he said, public service is the highest calling. And I can think of nothing better to use my skills and gifts for in the service of my country, because the country has given me so much. And I do feel that. You know, my parents came from a very, very small village in India, and not in their wildest dreams would they have figured that I would be where I am. And it is a privileged position to be an associate deputy minister and a public service in general. And it is, I believe, public service is the highest calling that we have in Canada. And so for that reason, you know, when you couple that with the call to action by the clerk, I think we are in a special moment because we are talking about what it means to be inclusive, what the lived experiences were. We are talking about systemic discrimination. And, you know, we were talking about, you know, Gina said something really interesting about Canada. And you know, somebody once said, when you've gotten rid of all of the other kinds of racism, and supremacy and all those things, what is left is systemic discrimination. And I think right now in Canada, in the public service of Canada, there is tremendous goodwill and effort and sustained focus on eliminating systemic discrimination and racism in the public service to build a more inclusive public service that serves Canada better. And we're having conversations like this one. Some of them will be like this, where we're talking about our experience. Some of them are going to be very difficult because we're going to hear things about ourselves, about our organizations, about what we've done intentionally or unintentionally to people, and what it is like to be an Indigenous person in the public service or in the healthcare system, or a member of a racialized minority, or a Black public servant, or a member of the LGBTQ2 community, and and we're going to hear that, and we have to accept it and do better. And I think it's great that we're talking about things like advocacy, and we're changing the narrative around this to be a better public service, not a nicer place to work, but a place where employees can feel successful and they grow and they develop and they contribute and they're promoted, and the barriers that have happened for generations are gone. And that's the public service that we're here today to talk about achieving. And as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this. Not very many accountants don't get passionate, trust me. They take that away from you when they give you the designation. But I'm passionate about the public service. Like Gina, I love the public service. I love it. And I'm passionate, and it's great when there's two things that kind of come together. And I think this is a wonderful moment in the history of our public service, because this is the first time I'm talking about it. And I think that if we all do that and we work collectively together, we will build the public service that serves Canadians better than it has ever done at any time in our history. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Erwin. I'll invite Natalie to introduce herself now.
Not sure how I'm going to follow that up. I really feel fortunate to be sharing this panel with this amazing guest today. So look, who am I? Natalie. I identify as biracial. So my father is from a northern part of Spain, very Caucasian, unlike Spaniards that tend to have olive skin and dark hair. And my mother is Haitian. And they arrived in Canada in the mid-70s when I was all but 11 months old. And so I celebrated my very first birthday in Montreal. And please don't do the math, because that reveals my age, and that wasn't a very strategic move on my part. But that being said, I've always identified, even though I wasn't born in Canada, my identity has been Canadian. And as I was reflecting on introducing myself, I should mention that my father used to work for the international development arm of what is now Global Affairs Canada. And so as such, we were posted overseas. And so I pretty much spent my formative years mostly outside of Canada, with a couple of years in between in Canada and then back out to posting. And so my formative years and my identity as a Canadian was very much shaped actually through the eyes of those in those countries that I interacted with, who really saw Canada as the beacon for opportunity, for equity, for inclusion. And so I actually never quite felt more Canadian when I was growing up overseas, because of how people perceived us as Canadians residing in those countries and working for and representing Canada. I was really struck when I came back and my parents continued their travels and their work. I came back for university, and that's when it really hit me. And I started to question my Canadian identity, because as I started university, being asked where I was from and answering from Ottawa was often, most times than not, met with, no, well, where are you really from? And when I provided the answer back, it's sort of again an insistence, yeah, but like, where were you born? And so, a little bit like Arun, I just, found ways over the years to try and either not bypass the question, but try and give as simple of an answer to try and avoid the perpetual prompting, which now that I take a step back and reflect on it, kind of got annoying a little bit when people didn't accept your answer. And so I became a bit savvier and then started to ask back, well, what is it that you want to know? When people started to press, is it where I was born, where my parents are from, where I grew up, where I live today? Because if I were to give you an answer to each of those questions, it would be a different answer. I don't question that people's intentions were to find out a little bit more about me. But when I reflect back on some of the insistence, sometimes that just got plain annoying, and that's just me sharing very open and authentically. Similar to Gina and Arun, I've been in the public service now for just over 20 years, and I find myself to be extremely fortunate and privileged. I've had access to amazing bosses, mentors, I would even say sponsors, although I don't think that those folks would consider themselves sponsors. But when I've reflected on my career, I've had great opportunities and been provided with spaces to showcase my talent and my potential. And I'd say culminating now in the role that I currently have, where I get to support public servants in terms of learning around equity and inclusion, and having the privilege of taking part in these types of conversations with different groups to get a real sense for what public servants are asking for, where we can be helpful, and where we will need to prioritize the supports that we hope we can bring to public servants as we continue to navigate this space and navigate these conversations. So that's a bit about me, and à toi, Isabelle. Merci.
Merci, Nathalie. I'd like to follow up with a first question for Gina. What are some of the ways or form that racism can be present in teams or in the workplace that may go unnoticed by managers?
Thank you for the question. As has been said prominently throughout this session and in the previous session, racism and exclusion can be very blatant in front of you, but most of the time it's very quiet and insidious. And it really comes from our unconscious prejudices. Conscious or unconscious racism could manifest itself subtly through very casual interpersonal conversations amongst employees, for instance. Arun talked about microaggressions. These probably feature more prominently, and I would suspect more numbers. I'll give you a few examples. Repeated comments about hair texture or style or clothing, comments being made about accommodations for certain employees for cultural holidays or religious reasons. Comments about single parents being absent regularly from the office. I heard this, and it probably still goes on. Statements about the need to just get over it, be it Indian residential schools or human rights violations, or the fact that treaties were signed hundreds of years ago. These types of aggressions. So the exclusion of certain individuals from certain meetings or projects, etc. So unfortunately, there's also racism and exclusion in our day-to-day practices, in our way of building the rules and the system, as Senator Marie St. Clair put it. It doesn't always come from a bad intention. Sometimes it definitely comes from a lack of knowledge or a lack of experience, etc. Either way, the consequences are dire, and it's really time to tackle them. So we learned, for instance, in our work around Many Voices, One Mind, that there were many barriers that were faced by Indigenous peoples at each stage of the employment process. These were real and very systemic. And so in essence, these are things that we're tackling now, but definitely something that I wanted to focus on today is the microaggressions and sort of the unconscious bias that we feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Evelyn, I'd like to ask you, how can managers become more aware of their own biases and open the door and be receptive to feedback from staff or colleagues on how they themselves might be discriminatory or biased?
That's hard. I think human nature, right? Part of it is, we don't like admitting that we have a deficit or a gap in this area. And I think when it comes to, when we talk about systemic discrimination and racism, it becomes very loaded, right? And it's like, well, I don't have that, conscious or not. And I think it becomes very, very difficult. And so I think the first step, and I've always said that some of the best leadership skills that you will ever develop is self-awareness, knowing when you did well, knowing when you didn't do well, and holding yourself to a very high standard, right? So being aware that, people have unconscious biases and overt biases, and there are microaggressions, right? I think what Gina was just talking about is incredibly important. The comments that, people make that can be incredibly hurtful, and to say, oh, I need to be more careful. And I know that a lot of people say, I don't like tiptoeing around. This is not what this is, and this is not about things that you can and can't say. These are words that actually cause injury. And so being aware that, one, that we all as people have the potential to do that, and you have to guard against it. and set yourself up as leaders to a very, very high bar. It is very easy. We had, when I was at Global Affairs, the deputy had a town hall in June, and somebody, one of the young, brilliant diplomats who I know very well, she said, when somebody said to her, "Wow, I didn't expect you to be that articulate," how she took that, it's a microaggression, and being very conscious of that. So that's the first thing, holding yourself up to a high bar. I said the second thing is really being aware of the others or around you and your impact on them. As a leader, you do have a disproportionate impact on those around you. And, being the only Indigenous woman or Black woman or visible or racialized minority in a room full of white people, Gina was talking about a room with pictures of colonial men. Well, how do you think that makes people feel? And do we not expect that is going to impact on performance, right? And people think, okay, now how am I going to navigate through that situation? So I think, again, looking at the structural things that we have and that we as leaders consciously or unconsciously reinforce, we do need to look at those, right? Somebody once said, good policy it starts with asking yourself good questions. Well, I think, being more inclusive also starts with asking yourself good and tough questions. I think the final thing I'd like to say is about having uncomfortable conversations. There's a great podcast called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho. You should watch it. But again, having conversations where, you aren't going to get a pat on the back, that people can say, and here's kind of how it really is, what your work environment and the culture that you create. Because unless you know that, and unless you're building an environment that has enough trust imbued in it, you're never going to be able to really tackle it. And then, so part of it is, and it's hard not being defensive. I get defensive too. But how do you create that environment where people don't feel that they have to internalize things, but they can talk about openly, and that you're not getting defensive and having or stifling conversation, right? It's not easy, but I think it's necessary for change to occur.
Thank you, Edwin. That leads well to my next question to Natalie. Could you share your thoughts on what managers can do to create an environment that is safe and fair for people of color?
Environments that are safe and fair. I have to say psychological safety is very, very important in terms of creating that. So look, it might sound simplistic, but I think in terms of creating that safe environment, I would say that listening is the first part. I think as we're undertaking these conversations as managers, it behooves us to listen more than intervene or talk. Making room for authentic and genuine listening is important. And through that listening, being able to demonstrate that we're open to the lived experiences of others and to whatever might come forward if you actually make the time and the space for that to occur. I think as well, to the extent that you're comfortable sort of being open and vulnerable and sharing your own lived experience. Whether you're racialized or not, we all bring something. We're all humans, we have experiences, lived experiences. And I think as we're doing here with Gina and Arun is sharing these experiences, hopefully shows that we too have, lived experiences to bring. And so hopefully that encourages others to share and feel that it is indeed a safe space to be able to bring those experiences forward. I think by doing this, it builds greater trust. And with that trust, I think people hopefully are more likely to come forward to either share or to bring about and highlight for you an issue that might be taking place. But I think it starts with listening, but also being open as a manager to sharing yourself and creating that environment that creates trust for others to be able to do the same.
Merci. Thank you. Gina, could you reflect on what managers can do to encourage and make it easy for those who are victims of racism to come forward and share their experiences?
Certainly. So this being very similar to the previous question, I would say I'd emphasize what Natalie's points just were. Being open-minded and listening really just to create that safe space for for the person who is going to confide in you what is going on. So you're a manager, you're all set to take this on. You want people who are being victimized to come forward, and you want to set up an environment for that. So really listening to them and guiding them to a resource that they would need. This will be an empowering way to move forward. So I talked about racial gaslighting earlier. I talked about having experienced that myself. This involves derailing accusations of racism by shifting the scrutiny onto the accuser, and thereby forcing the victim to question and reassess their own response. Did I not see that right? Am I the person that's wrong here? And so that really needs to be avoided. And when you see that, for instance, in a meeting happening, you need to take that offline immediately, because there's some trauma that can unfold as right then and there, and that needs to be dealt with very carefully, but it needs to be dealt with. Giving a voice to Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, Asian peoples, other racialized peoples, colleagues, but really not to the point where you're leaning on them to address those issues. That's really important as well. Now, I'm an Indigenous woman who has taken those issues on, has embraced working on these issues and trying to advise managers and colleagues, but not everyone is going to do that, or not everyone wants to do that. Just because they're Indigenous doesn't mean they want to work on Indigenous issues, doesn't mean they want to be necessarily part of a network. So making sure that people are comfortable in taking on certain roles. I would also say, really develop a habit of proactively scheduling bilateral discussions with team members to really know how they're faring. If they're fostering a climate of trust or experiencing a climate of trust, or if they're sharing difficult experiences, try to have that level of trust with people who work with you, that they're opening up to some of the things they may be encountering. And then I would say, just make sure that that measurable objectives are put into performance assessments, reminding everyone of their responsibilities to ensure equity and fairness in the workplace is absolutely key. And doing some of these things, along with other things Natalie said and Arun said, will really set up that environment for victims of racism to come forward and share their experiences.
Thank you, Gina. These are good suggestions to help us become allies. And Natalie, any recommendations on how managers should respond to a staff member who comes to them with a problem with regards to racism? What resources are available?
Good question. I think it's important it's going to seem like I'm repeating myself, but to really take the time to listen and unpack what that is. Don't make any assumptions, and really take the time to listen and really unpack the nature of the problem or issue that's being brought forward. I think as a manager, we can't all be expected to have the answers to everything, but I think surrounding ourselves with the knowledge of the resources that are available, whether it's for us as managers to support us in helping the employee, or resources to refer the employee to directly. So certainly managers should be seeking counsel from resources like your ombudsman organizations. Most organizations have them. Your labor relations advisor, again, it really depends on the nature, but I'm giving you some examples of resources to turn to. If it has to do with an issue perhaps with a colleague, could the services of informal conflict management be helpful? The employee assistance program, if you're not a trained counselor, just to know that, you need to refer folks to the appropriate resources as well. The resources I mentioned around, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, it could be an issue related to just having more knowledge or learning in certain areas, and referring them to those appropriate resources. I think at the end of the day is to not make assumptions as to what that might be. Listening and just turning to the resources that are best placed. If you don't feel equipped yourself as a manager to be able to refer the employee to, or to support you in getting prepared for supporting your employee.
Thank you, Nathalie. A sincere thank you to all for your insights. I think we're getting a lot of questions, so I will now open the floor to the questions from participants. A reminder that you may send your questions by pressing the raise hand icon in the upper right corner of your screen. So I'll go to the first question. At TC, we had a VP of Human Rights Commission tell us that zero tolerance is not a way to go, as this has the effect of pushing this important topic underground. Could you comment on this, please? So I guess I'll go to Arun for this one.
You mean that's a, you mean there's lots of talk about zero tolerance. And so again, this is a hard question for me to answer because I do personally, I don't know how you don't have zero tolerance for it, right? But at the same time, you have to leave room for growth, right? And I don't think that, you know, the last question, you know, one of the questions in the previous one, well, what do you do if you're a victim of racism? Well, if there's not zero tolerance, what you're going to ask people to really do is internalize it. And that's not a good thing. Our systems, our processes, our structures, what the clerk has said is that there is no place for this in the public service. Okay? And so there is no tolerance, and I believe there's zero tolerance for it. However, it doesn't also mean there isn't room for growth and learning from those consciously or unconsciously who do this, right? And it's about building, you know, getting rid of this as part of our system. I would probably respectfully disagree a little bit with that comment because, again, I don't know how we would ever say that kind of behavior would be tolerated or excused. And you know, I think what Gina's, you know, I can't remember what the exact phrase was, like racial gaslighting. Is that what you said? And I think that's the problem when we don't talk about when it is what it is. It's wrong. And you can't say, oh, well, maybe I misinterpreted it, or maybe they didn't really. No, it's wrong. So I would probably, personally, I would draw a distinction between what was said there and what I believe on that.
Thank you, Evan.
I think a very a mature manager needs to indicate that there is zero tolerance. That has to be the opinion of the manager. Otherwise, if you start to you know, weasel word your way out of that, then I think you're sending a mixed message, which is going to cause some confusion, and it's probably inappropriate.
Excellent, thank you. Next question we received was, how do you define unconscious bias, and how would you define it if it is brought to the attention of, that someone's actions are racist and that they continue to commit these acts without embarrassment? So I'm not sure if someone would like to start with that question. I might go to Nathalie on this one.
Sure, and again, I'll be really clear, I'm not an expert. There's a whole science between, you know, on unconscious bias and whatnot. What I do know from the learning that I've done and reading on the topic is that to be human is to be biased. So we all have biases. And what's important here is to be first acknowledge that we do have them and to make a commitment to examine what those are, to see if those biases are intentionally or unintentionally having an impact and creating barriers. You know, as public servants, we're developing policies, we're developing programs, we're delivering services. I think it's important that we check ourselves on a regular basis in terms of those biases to make sure that they're not creeping into how we're, you know, doing the business of the public service, so that we're keeping ourselves in check. So I would say that in terms of defining, you know, what it is, and we all have different biases. It comes from our lived experience, what we've been exposed to, et cetera. But to be human is to be biased. So it's not about feeling guilty about that, but biases can lead to unintended negative impacts if we don't check them. And we need to do that work, not just the one time by taking training once and then walking away saying I'm bias free. That's not how it works, but to continue that ongoing work and reflection. So that's what I'll say about what I'm continuously learning about bias.
Thank you, Natalie. The next question we received was, thank you for sharing how significant events can impact your daily work. When events like Joan Equasham's that happen, do you have a suggestion to open a safe space to employees to come out about how they feel and that they may need to be accommodated? How can I acknowledge as a manager that it is okay to feel disturbed?
I guess I spoke to Joyce Echequan, and I would say that it's important for a manager to always be scanning the environment. We know that, to watching, knowing what's front and center on the news. If it's a Black man that has just been murdered in Ottawa and that's making the news, there will be some Black men, there will be some Black people who will be affected by that. Just like Joyce Echequan, where many Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women, were affected by that in a traumatic way. So I think it's just good practice for managers to be aware of the environment and to be scanning it and to be checking in with employees when they tweak that there might be an issue here. If you hear of an Asian incident, well, that may not just affect Asian people, of course, but it can affect all types of racialized people. I'm just saying that it's important to acknowledge those things. Maybe you do it in a meeting where you say, let's take a moment to acknowledge Joyce Echequan and what has happened, and that will go a long way, I would say, to opening up a conversation. So a manager's reaction to events around the world and in Canada will make a big difference for staff members. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to ask another question, which is, can you provide examples of how the key leadership qualities or competencies achieve inclusivity in the workplace? I don't know if someone wants to start with that one, maybe Nathalie or Arun.
I can start, and Arun, does that work? Yes, the leadership competencies, I think there are a lot of linkages actually that can be drawn. Upholding integrity and respect, I mean, that's a key and core ingredient to this business of, equity and inclusion. Without it, we're not going to move forward. So I think looking at how those competencies are defined, I think they're very much aligned to supporting the objectives of greater equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm thinking as well, the mobilizing people. I believe in the presentation, I mentioned this philosophy of nothing without us, and making sure that we're involving those who are most impacted by these issues in defining the solution, in being part of designing and co-creating those particular solutions, I think is very important. So as managers, it's our responsibility to bring people together to create those spaces and mobilize and engage. So I see the linkages there in terms of how doing that supports healthier and more respectful workplaces. And then I'd say perhaps also around collaborating with partners and stakeholders, again, around this concept of nothing without us, and how we consult, engage, but really co-design solutions. I know that that's some of the things that we're working on my team as we look to develop learning. Who am I to say or speak to the experiences of absolutely every intersection in society? So reaching out to the appropriate networks, the relevant stakeholders and subject matter experts and those with lived experience to help sort of inform the learning and the resources so that those experiences are authentically represented in the learning that we're putting together. So those are a few that come to mind.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions. I don't think we'll even be able to cover all of them, so we'll share them afterwards after the event, and we'll try to reflect on all the questions we're getting. The next one is, I like the idea of including inclusivity in performance agreements. What performance indicators would you use to measure and assess if the goal was successfully achieved? So maybe Arun, I'll invite you to think about that one. I'm giving you hard questions, but you're my new champion, so I'm testing you.
We're going to have to talk about this afterwards, aren't we? So I think it's important that objectives do get put in performance agreements, right? It is a very clear, because performance agreements are an articulation of our values and what we want to achieve as an organization, and you can't exclude inclusion and diversity from that. Performance measures are difficult at the so I think there has to be a mix of qualitative indicators, right? And I think asking people to articulate this, right, and talking about, well, how is the climate around your environment different? Getting the feedback from employees. The presentation talked about disaggregated data. So if I'm going to pivot into, there is data that we should be looking at. We obviously do need to be getting better data. I think looking, every manager runs a staffing process, right? And, I remember the Public Service Commission a number of years ago looked at external recruitment and looking at the drop off of candidates. So why is it that we are not and looking at how those things are done, in a call to action, it was talking about what are the special measures that we've done to ensure that we've increased representation and an active articulation of the management community saying, here's what I have done, right? And as opposed to, I think sometimes we get caught up in how we're measuring it, but if you're doing it, you should be able to describe it. I think you have a hard time describing it when you're not doing it. And so again, we're going to rely on a lot of qualitative things, but at the same time, if we are doing these things, it will translate into something, right? So either you'll see it in the PSES results, or you'll see it by greater representation, by accessibility, right? Are we building in accessibility and removing barriers by design before somebody has to act? Well, that's an inclusive workplace. And so I think managers being able to talk about that and writing that, how I've met it in there, and even writing it on behalf, knowing and seeing it as a manager, seeing that in your people is an important way of measuring performance.
Thank you, Ellen. The next question is specifically for Gina. The question is, are you optimistic about the intent to promote Indigenous public service employees' development and promotion to leadership roles? As a First Nations employee, I found that people perceive my advancement because I am First Nations as opposed to my skills, ability, and work. Thank you.
Well, I'm very optimistic. I'm an optimist at heart, definitely when it comes to Indigenous peoples, our resilience, our strength, our assets, our abilities to move forward. I believe in us so much that I know that we will succeed. So very optimistic. I would also say I would also add that there continues to be barriers, that we continue to struggle at times with a lot of issues. But definitely, I think, some of the things that we're seeing right now happening, the DM diversity commitments, the inclusion in performance agreements around representation, increasing numbers, making measuring what matters and making it meaningful will make a difference as well. So, for instance, if it's acting opportunities, providing Indigenous peoples with acting opportunities, because the data is demonstrating that Indigenous people are not getting as many acting opportunities as non-Indigenous people. So that's a measure that really matters because it makes a difference. It's meaningful to the actual outcomes. So I am optimistic. I see a lot of things happening now. I see a lot of initiatives underway. Again, very proud of Many Voices, One Mind. I'm holding all deputy minister colleagues to account on that through report cards and scorecards and measuring what matters there as well. And I really see my colleagues stepping up to that challenge.
Can I say something there? I know one of the things that the questioner said was really struck me, right? Because I've heard this a lot is, as I go through, what if people think that the only reason I've gotten through, and I think that is something that we do need to end. And that ends with the management community. It really does. It is incumbent. We hire on merit, and we have to make sure that when we do hire, it is clear that why we're doing it. Yes, we're going to have inclusion and equity, and I'm a very, very strong proponent of reaching into communities so we ensure that we're representative, that we're intentional about promoting, but we are promoting talented people who can do the job and produce results for Canadians. I think part of the issue of systemic racism is that feeling that people have. How many times do visible minorities and women have to worry about when they sit in that room? Is that, are people going to think that the only reason I'm here is because we have to say that? I get it, but we have, as an institution, that has to disappear. It really does. And the management community has a special responsibility when you guys hire more than anybody else does. Make sure that you dispel that myth very, very quickly.
Can I also add, if anything, to emphasize, because that's exactly where I get sort of stuck. It's about merit and representation, not merit or representation. And so I think it's important to constantly check ourselves on that. And if I were to be a bit blunt and maybe at the risk of being a bit provocative, but I mean, if we were sitting here on a panel of entirely non-racialized public servants, the question of merit wouldn't come up because it would be assumed. And so why would it not also be assumed when you're sitting in front of a group of candidates that reflect the diversity of this wonderful country? And so it's about merit and representation. So I'm hoping, and as you said, Arun, that as managers, as where it starts and it continues with executives, all of us have, I think, an important role to play in kind of dispelling that and in quashing that, really. Thanks.
Thank you all. Another question is, as a manager, if I witness discrimination against a team member, do I step in immediately, or does that take away their own voice? Maybe Natalie on this one.
I mean, I think it's important to call it out, but I mean, I think it's important to call it out using your judgment and making sure you're doing so appropriately. I think, again, do not make any assumptions. I mean, if you're seeing something that's bothersome, that you're perceiving as discrimination, I think it's being able to very respectfully and without judgment try and understand where that comment or action may have come from. And I think if you start with a place of seeking to understand rather than judgment, you try and avoid putting the person on the defensive, because again, there may be something that was conveyed, intent versus impact. The intent might have been good, it just came out completely wrong. And I think it's approaching these with seeking to understand rather than confrontation, to just try to get to a place where you can have a dialogue. And if that is not possible, this is where you can, whether bring in your manager or others to help in terms of supporting you through that. But I think, and that's my own personal opinion, but I think in order we need to seek to understand first and foremost, and to do that is creating that environment to see what might be behind that. Oh, you're muted.
I knew I was going to get this one. My apologies. So I think we have time for a last question. This comes from someone that says, as a white male leader, I feel ill-equipped to talk about these issues as I don't have the lived experiences of my racialized employees. What are some strategies to ensure I'm coming from a place of wanting to learn as opposed to already knowing the answers, as some people expect from leaders?
I would say exactly how you pose the question, indicating exactly that you want to learn, you don't understand necessarily, but you're interested. And so let's have the conversation. Just openness, humility, genuine respect will go a long way.
Agree. Thank you all. Okay, I think we could continue for probably hours, but we will note the questions and we will make sure that through other events of the NMC, we get an opportunity to answer them. So this concludes today's event. Federal public service is stronger and most effective when we reflect the diversity of Canada's population we serve. I noted many great takeaways from today's session, namely the importance of educating ourselves and having conversations, frank conversations, as Gina just mentioned, and also the need to reflect on barriers to inclusivity that could be present within our own teams or programs. It is our hope that the information and tools shared with you today will be helpful as we continue to make progress to tackle racism and increase representation of Black people and other racialized groups, Indigenous people, and persons with disability. On behalf of the school and the NMC, I'd like to thank Arun, Gina, Natalie, and all you from across the country for being part of today's discussion. Recognizing that one of the strengths of Canada is our diversity, I would like to thank our participant, as I said, from coast to coast for joining us. Thank you. The CSPS has developed additional learning material on leading conversations on systemic racism and racial discrimination for managers. The tool will help you to prepare through introspection for conversations about systemic racism and racial discrimination. The NMC will share this resource in our follow-up email to participants and via our newsletter. Over the next few weeks, the NMC will also host several regional events, including topics on diversity and inclusion, as well as ways to better manage and work virtually. So I greatly encourage you all to follow our Twitter handle at NMC_CNG, our Facebook and GC Connects page, as well as our newsletters for all updates and registration details. I also invite you to join the Canada School on February 26th from 1:30 to 3 for an event on the new People Management Policy Suite, where the Treasury Board Secretariat will present its policy suite on people management to meet the evolving needs of the workforce in the context of COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Be part of the continued improvement of our workplace culture and learn about the roles, responsibilities, and key considerations related to the duty to accommodate, telework, conflicts of interest, performance and talent management, and more. I hope that you enjoyed today's event. Your feedback is very important to us, and I invite you to complete the electronic evaluations that you will be receiving in the coming days. The school has more events to offer to you, and I encourage you to visit their website to keep up to date and register to all future learning opportunities. Once again, thank you all and have a wonderful day.